Any physio questions from last stuff we covered? I'm going to finish up this metabolism section briefly here, and then we're going to move on into the reproductive cycle. So if anyone's been waiting on bated breath to get to that section and all the awkwardness it will entail, then we're going to get there today. Okay, so we're talking about hormonal control of metabolism. One of the things we left off on was going to be growth hormone. Typically, growth hormone is going to have what sort of effect on metabolism? Typically increase, or typically going to see anabolic sort of effects here. We're going to see that actually can depend on what tissue you're looking at, what kind of effects it's going to have. We're going to look into that. What is going to inhibit the effects of growth hormone? Somatostatin, otherwise known as growth hormone inhibiting hormone. That kind of makes sense, right? Just based off the name right there, right? And again, what is the hypothalamus secreting to stimulate growth hormone release? Growth hormone releasing hormone. Again, it's all in the name right there. Like, sometimes they make things confusing, sometimes they make it just as straightforward as that. Good. Some other things that can help to stimulate release of growth hormone can be things like having a high protein intake with a low carbohydrate sort of meal. Things like that can actually help to stimulate release of growth hormone. And then you'll see the same negative feedback loops will be kicking in here, where eventually that can then feed back and kind of shut down the release of growth hormone once you have things kind of bounce out from the state, right? So typically you're going to find it has both anabolic and some catabolic effects as well. So again, one of the things that's nice from an anabolic standpoint is going to increase things like amino acid uptake. You're going to have more protein synthesis. But on the flip side, you can actually have some lipid metabolism. It actually can stimulate lipolysis. And why might that be useful? Because we can break down fats and then we can get energy out of that, right? We can eventually convert that into glucose, right? That can be very useful. Or ketones we can use for energy as well. So again, those are some good things they can do. So again, catabolic in the fat tissue, but more anabolic in say like the skeletal muscle. Also within the liver, it's going to stimulate things like bone growth and cartilage, and then also you can see some increased protein synthesis within the liver as well. So again, those will all be some of those stimulatory sort of effects there. It's kind of interesting. Anyone like follow bodybuilding at all or kind of interested in that? Well, this is one of those hormones that people can use, say, in excess in order to increase their muscle growth and things like that. What's kind of interesting, though, is if you look at pictures of, if you ever Google growth hormone gut, it's kind of interesting because, again, you get nice big muscles from using growth hormone, but you also have this kind of this hypertrophy of the organs itself. So again, these like bodybuilders are like huge, but they have these like massive guts, almost like they're pregnant, because again, they have this organic hypertrophy that happens along with that. It's kind of interesting sort of side effect. So again, I would not recommend taking excess growth hormone for those purposes. But anywho, next thing we're going to look at is going to be regulation of calcium. This already, but I think it bears repeating, looking at some of the different hormonal effects that this is going to have on calcium. So why do we need calcium? We need it for the bones. We need it for muscle contractions. We need it for all sorts of different intracellular processes. So again, very, very important that we keep this in a good homeostatic sort of level here. And so again, what are the three main ways that we can affect calcium levels in the body? Well, so even more broad than that. The breakdown of what? Bone, good, so I can raise calcium levels by breaking down bone, or I can decrease calcium levels by stimulating bone growth, good, so that's one. The kidneys, good, so I can either reabsorb or secrete calcium. GI tract is the other big one, right? So again, those are the three main places where we can kind of regulate calcium. We're going to see the different hormones are going to have some big effects on that. So again, certainly things like calcitonin, parathyroid hormone, calcitriol, or this activated form of vitamin D is going to be important here, but also some other things we'll see are going to be things like thyroxine and also estrogen, right? Looking at the effects of, let's look at calcitonin first. So where does calcitonin get released from? In the thyroid. Remember the parafollicular cells that are in the thyroid? Those can release calcium, usually in the presence of what? High or low calcium levels? Usually in high calcium level, right? So calcitonin gets released from the thyroid. It then can cause what, do you think? So what does it do to the bone, you think? Increases calcium deposition, right? So again, we're trying to lower calcium levels, so we need to get rid of calcium. We need to put it somewhere. So let's go ahead and put it in the bone. If it's in the bone, it doesn't get reflected in the serum levels. So that could be one thing we can see. So this will stimulate calcium deposition in the bones, right? So when we say deposition, normally think like in a legal sense, like the bones are going to tell you like what happened on the night of July 17th. Not the deposition we're talking about here. This is actually we're putting calcium into the bones itself, right? The other things you're going to see is going to have big effects on the kidneys to reduce that calcium uptake. So again, if I'm not reabsorbing at the kidneys, where does it go? Out the urine, right? So then I can get rid of that and have increased calcium excretion in those cases. So then as calcium levels start to drop back down, then you should start to see calcitonin levels should then do what? should go down as well, because remember the initial stimulus for calcitonin was increased calcium levels, right? The hypercalcemia. As levels drop down back to normal, calcitonin should then also drop down to lower levels than it was before, right? Good. Parathyroid hormone we know does the opposite. So what stimulates parathyroid hormone release? So hypocalcemia should be stimulating parathyroid release. Where does that come from? The parathyroid. Good, fantastic. Everyone knew that. And so the big effects you're going to see here is going to stimulate intestinal absorption of calcium, right? So again, that's one way we can increase the intake of it. It's going to increase release of calcium from the bones, and that's through what cell? Osteoclast, right? That's called bone resorption, or calcium resorption from the bones. So again, it's going to be stimulating osteoclast activity. And then you can also find that what's it going to do to the kidneys, you think? Again, increase reabsorption. Okay, good. So this is doing all of those things. What can also help to increase reabsorption of calcium from the from the kidneys and also from the GI tract? What other hormones important here? Perhaps a vitamin we've discussed. Vitamin D. Good. Vitamin D is important here, right? And so remember the vitamin D that you get through your diet or from sun exposure, is that the activated form? No, you need to have it activated where at? In the liver first, and then in the kidneys, right? So again, if you have someone who has really bad liver disease or really bad kidney disease, doesn't matter how much ergo or cholecalciferol you give them, which are the two in the main D2 and D3 that we will give to patients, they can't activate it. It's not going to do them any good, which is why in a lot of chronic kidney disease patients, you're going to find they have a lot of issues with things like osteoporosis. They have something called renal osteodystrophy. It can be very negative effects on the calcium overall. And we'll talk about that in renal stuff later on in farm, but just know this is a big. And again, as you're going to have decreased calcium levels, parathyroids are going to be stimulated to release parathyroid hormone. This is then going to increase the activity of this alpha-1 hydroxylase. So again, this is the final enzyme necessary to convert the 25-hydroxyvitamin D3, which is coming from the liver, right? So the liver is the first stop. And they'll convert it over to the total active form, this 125-dihydroxyvitamin D. Anyone know the other name for this? It's calcitriol. So if we see calcitriol, that's what it's going to be referring to. This is the activated form of vitamin D. So if I had someone who had really poor kidney function and I knew they could not activate vitamin D on their own, I can actually give them calcitriol. It's more expensive to give. However, if they can't form it themselves, this is can serve the same purpose here. Okay. So this should increase intestinal absorption, should also increase the amount of reabsorption from the kidneys that's occurring here, and is going to be stimulating osteoclast activity. Okay. As everything kind of gets back into normal, should have that negative feedback loop that occurs there. Again, look at just PTH itself. Again, we see the kidneys are stimulating vitamin D production, also stimulating dissolution of those calcium phosphate crystals, right? So again, that's basically where we're getting all that calcium from the bone. Osteoclasts are involved in doing this. Okay. And then just looking at another negative feedback loop for calcitonin itself, we already talked about that a little bit. But again, as calcium levels start to get back down to normal, that's when calcitonin should be inhibited at those points. Okay? To kind of understand the negative feedback loops, know if I were to change one of the variables there. So for instance, I change the calcium levels, what effect is that going to have on PTH? What effect is that going to have on calcitonin? When should they be increased or decreased, etc. Right? Okay. Other things to note here. So again, the effects of calcium, we can actually find that if you have decreased levels of estrogen, that should also decrease the deposit of calcium in the bones. And so who might that be important in? In women? Which kind of women? Menopausal women. When we say menopausal? They're not producing estrogen from? The ovaries, yeah. Well, so we're going to look at that in the reproductive section coming up next. But that's going to be one of the big changes you see in menopause. They're actually reducing the amount of estrogen producing. You're going to find that has negative effects on the bone. You're going to see decreased deposit of calcium in the bone. Now, do you guys have to worry about osteoporosis? We still do, right? So it's still something you have to be considerate of. However, we're going to look at why that is going to be less of an issue, as you're going to see for women in just a second here. Other things you're going to find, you're going to see that if you have increased thyroxine, which typically is increasing metabolism, that also will decrease the deposition of calcium in the bones. That can have some negative effects overall on bone health. And then the increased dihydroxy vitamin D, you're going to find that also is increasing intestinal absorption of calcium. So knowing how we change these, what effects it's going to have on calcium can be important to know. Okay. All right, so looking at estrogen and testosterone, one of the things we're going to find in the reproductive section next up is that with a lot of your hormones, especially like the sex hormones, there's going to be some interconversion that actually happens in here. So what you're going to find is that typically when you're looking at testosterone production for a male throughout their life, does it stay constant? Does it go up? Does it go down? It goes down over time, but is it going to go down to the same degree as like a female would as far as estrogen levels? No, typically, because again, they still have their testes, they're still working, they can still produce testosterone. So you're going to see that even though men will have decreasing bone mass with age, they can convert that testosterone they're producing into estrogen. Some portion of it is going to get converted over into estrogen, and that can actually help to stave off that osteoporosis. That helps to increase that deposition of calcium into the bone, which is why it's less of an issue for older men. However, it is still a concern. You still want to make sure they're getting good calcium levels, good vitamin D, etc. Right? And again, what's the problem with osteoporosis? You get fractures, and then fractures are a huge impact on their morbidity, mortality, as you'll see in older patients. Oftentimes, that's what leaves them bedridden, and then that leads to a whole host of other problems, and it's no good, right? So you want to stave off these fractures as best you can. Okay, so again, just another table kind of showing you the different hormone effects here as far as regulation of calcium goes, so good to refer back to this for studying purposes. Right, so again, looking at that deposition and reabsorption, again, what is helping to lay down calcium in the bone? What type of cells? Osteoblasts, taking it up. Osteoclast, good. Again, you need to make sure you're having constant turnover. Again, you want to make sure to keep that health up. You have constant turnover where you have resorption and deposition. However, when you have things like osteoporosis develop, that's when you have more resorption than you actually have deposition occurring there. So again, overbalancing either side can be problematic. Right? Again, just looking at someone who had, say, normal bone versus more osteoporotic bones, you notice here a lot more kind of holes there. It gets much more, you can see how the structural integrity of this will go down over time, and definitely lead to things like fractures be more likely. Okay, so any questions on the end of that section?